Look, let's get into the receipts because what we are seeing right now is a masterclass in authoritarian gaslighting and a chilling wake-up call for the world. We've been tracking these Berlin peace talks all week, where the United States and European allies laid out what President Trump called a platinum standard proposal, a deal that included NATO-style security guarantees for Ukraine in exchange for Kiev dropping its NATO aspirations. It was a massive, gut-wrenching compromise from President Zelenskyy. But how did the Kremlin respond? Putin didn't just say no, he effectively spit in the face of the diplomatic process. While Zelenskyy was standing there, showing the world he's willing to negotiate to save his people, Putin's spokesperson Dmitry Peskov came out and dismissed the whole thing, saying they haven't even seen the formal details and doubling down on the demand that Ukraine basically surrender its territory and its sovereignty. It's the same old playbook. Use the word peace as a smokescreen while launching 18,000 drones at civilians to freeze them out in the dead of winter. And President Zelenskyy is calling it exactly what it is. In his latest address, he didn't mince words. He warned that without a real, legally binding backstop, we aren't looking at peace. We're looking at a prolonged, multi-generational conflict. He's telling the coalition of the willing that if the aggressor gets a reward, the aggressor will never stop. You see the map? You see the 18% of Ukraine currently under the Russian boot. Putin wants a total capitulation, and Zelenskyy is drawing a line in the sand, saying Ukraine will not recognize the Donbas as Russian legally or factually. He's calling out the WWE cosplay diplomacy, where dictators pretend to want a deal while preparing for the next invasion. This is the 10% on fire that we keep talking about, that final dangerous gap where peace goes to die because one side refuses to recognize the right of a sovereign nation to actually exist. So where does that leave us? It leaves us at a crossroads. Zelenskyy is now pivoting, telling Washington and the EU that if Russia won't take the platinum deal, then the only language left is the language of consequences. We're talking tougher sanctions and more advanced long-range weapons. The message is clear. You can't have a Christmas truce with someone who wants to erase you from the map. As this war nears its 4-year anniversary, the MeidasMighty and everyone who cares about democracy needs to look at the facts, not the spin. We have a Ukrainian leader ready to find a way out, and a Russian dictator who thinks he can outlast the West's resolve. We're going to keep following the money and the munitions on this because the truth doesn't care about Putin's feelings. I'm Meiselas. This is the real news. The rejection of the so-called platinum proposal by the Kremlin represents a seismic shift in the geopolitical landscape, revealing the raw, unvarnished intentions of the Russian regime. For months, the international community has been told that the primary obstacle to peace was Ukraine's insistence on joining NATO, a red line that Moscow claimed was a direct threat to its national security. However, when the United States and its European allies finally brought a sophisticated, high-stakes framework to the table, one that offered Ukraine ironclad NATO-style security guarantees in exchange for a formal freeze on its membership aspirations, the mask finally slipped. This wasn't just a rejection of a policy, it was a rejection of the very concept of a sovereign Ukrainian state. By dismissing this proposal out of hand, Putin has exposed the fundamental lie at the heart of his special military operation. It was never truly about NATO expansion or border security, it was always about the total subjugation of a neighbor. What makes this moment so incredibly dangerous is the level of diplomatic bad faith we are witnessing from the Kremlin. The West offered a massive strategic concession, a platinum standard deal that required Ukraine to make the agonizing sacrifice of its long-term defensive goals to end the bloodshed today. But instead of engaging with the substance of the proposal, Moscow responded with bureaucratic dismissiveness, claiming they hadn't even seen the formal details while simultaneously ramping up drone strikes on civilian energy grids. This is the definition of a bad actor state using the language of diplomacy as a weapon of war. It's a masterclass in authoritarian gaslighting designed to exhaust the West's patience and fracture the unity of the democratic coalition. We have to look at the receipts here. If a deal that removes the NATO threat isn't enough for Putin, then nothing short of total Ukrainian capitulation will be. This rejection serves as a chilling wake-up call that we are no longer dealing with a traditional border dispute, but a relentless campaign of imperialist erasure. Every moment spent debating the nuance of Putin's position is a moment he uses to solidify his grip on occupied territories. This isn't just a policy failure, it's a direct challenge to the rules-based international order. The message coming out of Moscow is loud and clear. They don't want a seat at the table, they want to flip the table over. As we watch this diplomatic bridge burn, the reality becomes undeniable. You cannot negotiate a lasting peace with a regime that views your very existence as a provocation. The collapse of this proposal isn't the end of the conversation. It is the beginning of a much darker, more determined chapter in the fight for global democracy. President Zelensky's latest warning regarding a prolonged conflict is not just a rhetorical flair. It is a cold, calculated assessment of a new and devastating geopolitical reality. By calling out the inevitable multi-generational nature of this war following the Kremlin's rejection of the Berlin peace framework, Zelensky is stripping away the illusion that this is a simple border dispute that can be solved with a handshake. He is sounding the alarm that we are entering a phase of forever war, precisely because the aggressor has signaled that their appetite for territory is eclipsed only by their desire to wait out the West's collective attention span. This isn't a leader being pessimistic, this is a commander-in-chief looking at the receipts of nearly 4 years of total invasion and realizing that a truce without ironclad guarantees is merely a countdown to the next atrocity. The stakes here are incredibly high because this shift in messaging is a direct challenge to the fatigue narratives beginning to take root in Western capitals. Zelensky is essentially telling the world that if the current platinum diplomatic off-ramp is ignored, the alternative isn't a quiet stalemate, it is a permanent state of mobilization that will drain global resources for decades. He is highlighting the bad faith loop where Moscow uses peace talks as a tactical pause to rearm, only to strike back with more lethality once the pressure subsides. By warning of a conflict that could outlast the current generation of leaders, he is putting the burden of proof back on those who argue for de-escalation at any cost. You cannot de-escalate with a partner who views the total erasure of your national identity as a non-negotiable goal. This is the MeidasMighty moment of truth for international diplomacy. Zelensky is making it clear that a peace deal that rewards aggression is nothing more than a subsidized down payment on a future war. He is drawing a direct line between today's concessions and tomorrow's casualties. This warning is intended to puncture the bubble of those who believe we can simply freeze the map and walk away. If the global order allows a sovereign nation to be carved up in real time, the precedent set won't just haunt Ukraine, it will define the 21st century. We are watching the pivot from a battle for territory to a battle for time, and Zelensky's message is unmistakable. The only way to shorten a long war is to ensure the aggressor knows they cannot win it. The sovereignty line in the sand drawn by President Zelensky during the recent high-stakes Berlin summit is a masterclass in political resolve, effectively shutting the door on any proposal that demands the legal mutilation of the Ukrainian state. By explicitly stating that Ukraine will recognize the occupied Donbas and Crimea as Russian territory neither de jure by law nor de facto in practice, Zelensky has paralyzed the Kremlin's strategy of creeping annexation. This isn't just about maps or dusty borderlines, it is a foundational defense of the post-World War II international order. The message is clear: military occupation does not and will never equal legal ownership. Even as U.S. negotiators brainstormed complex free economic zones or demilitarized zones to bridge the gap, the Ukrainian leadership stood firm on the receipts. They know that once you concede the law, you concede the future, and they aren't about to hand Putin a signed deed to land he only holds through terror and blood. This refusal to compromise on territorial integrity is the ultimate pressure test for Western diplomacy. While some in Washington may be chasing a quick win or a 90% consensus on a peace framework, Zelenskyy is highlighting the final non-negotiable 10% that actually matters for long-term stability. He is making it undeniably clear that the Ukrainian constitution isn't a suggestion, it's a shield. You cannot have a just and lasting peace if the deal starts with the legal erasure of a sovereign nation's heartland. By holding this line, Kyiv is forcing the world to acknowledge the reality of the situation. Any agreement that rewards a land grab only invites the next invasion. This is the MeidasMighty breakdown of what real leadership looks like in the face of a bully. Zelenskyy is telling the global community that while Ukraine is willing to negotiate on security and logistics, it will never negotiate on its right to exist. The receipts from the Berlin talks show a leader who understands that a compromise that sacrifices the Donbas is simply a surrender wrapped in a different ribbon. As the pressure builds and the coalition of the willing looks for an exit ramp, the line in the sand remains unmoved. If we allow the world to return to a might makes right philosophy where borders are rewritten by the barrel of a tank, then no nation is truly safe. Zelenskyy's stand is a wake-up call to everyone who values democracy. The truth doesn't bargain, and sovereignty isn't for sale. The Kremlin's deployment of gaslighting diplomacy in the wake of the Berlin summit is a textbook example of how authoritarian regimes weaponize the negotiation table to mask battlefield aggression. For weeks, the world watched as Russian officials, led by Dmitry Peskov and Yuri Ushakov, performed a calculated dance of strategic ambiguity, claiming they had not even seen the formal details of the NATO-backed peace proposal, while simultaneously dismissing it as a deception. This is the core of the Russian playbook. Create a vacuum of information where they can project their own narrative, framing themselves as the seekers of permanent peace, while labeling every Western effort at a ceasefire as a mere tactical ploy to help Kyiv regroup. It is a chilling level of psychological warfare played out on the global stage, designed to exhaust the patience of the international community and convince the world that the victim of the invasion is actually the obstacle to its end. We have to look at the receipts of this diplomatic theater to see what is really happening. While Putin's aides are in Turkmenistan or Moscow giving interviews about needing peace, not a ceasefire, the Russian military is launching record-breaking waves of drone and missile strikes against Ukrainian energy grids. You cannot claim to be negotiating in good faith when you are actively trying to freeze a civilian population into submission. This isn't diplomacy, it's a smokescreen. By dismissing the Platinum proposal, which included massive concessions on NATO membership, Moscow has effectively admitted that their problem isn't with Ukraine's alliances, but with Ukraine's existence. They use the term brainwashing to describe Western diplomatic efforts, a classic projection from a regime that has spent years refining the art of the big lie. This is the MeidasMighty reality check. Putin isn't looking for an exit ramp. He's looking for a total capitulation wrapped in the language of a final settlement. The Kremlin's insistence on a comprehensive deal that reflects their maximalist territorial demands, including land they don't even physically control, is a demand for the West to validate war crimes as legal precedents. When Peskov says Russia wants a permanent peace, he means a peace where Ukraine is stripped of its defenses, its territory, and its sovereignty. As we track the money and the munitions, we see the truth that the Kremlin's words are meant to hide, that they are playing for time, betting that the democratic world will eventually tire of the gaslighting and simply walk away. But the facts remain undefeated, and as long as the world keeps calling out these tactical deceptions, the Kremlin's mask remains firmly off. The escalation of gray zone warfare in the final months of 2025 has transformed the Ukrainian winter into a brutal testing ground for a new brand of state-sponsored terror that operates just below the threshold of traditional military engagement. While diplomats in Berlin and Washington trade memos on peace frameworks, the reality on the ground is defined by a relentless, systematic campaign to weaponize the very elements of human survival. We are seeing the receipts of a Russian strategy that has pivoted from seizing territory to liquidating the functionality of a modern state. By launching nearly 10,000 drones and hundreds of missiles in a single quarter, Moscow isn't just targeting military outposts, they are surgically striking the transmission lines and substations that keep the lights on for millions. This is the gray zone in its most lethal form, a space where the front line is no longer a trench in the Donbas, but the thermostat in a civilian apartment in Kiev or Odessa. The sheer audacity of these strikes, occurring even as the Kremlin pays lip service to peace talks, reveals the true nature of their negotiation strategy. The MeidasMighty and anyone watching the facts can see that this is a deliberate attempt to break the Ukrainian spirit through a blackout blitz. In December 2025 alone, over 1 million Ukrainians found themselves without power as temperatures plummeted, all while Russian state media projected a narrative of inevitable victory. This is a cognitive warfare effort designed to force a capitulation by making daily life unsustainable. By targeting grain silos and railway stations, as we saw in the devastating strikes on Fastiv and Odessa, Putin is signaling that if he cannot own Ukraine, he will ensure there is nothing left to govern. This gray zone aggression is a global wake-up call because it proves that for the Kremlin, there is no distinction between a soldier and a senior citizen trying to stay warm. The receipts show that these aren't accidental collateral damages. They are deliberate, data-driven hits on the nervous system of the country. As the chief of MI6 recently warned, this export of chaos is a feature of the Russian approach to international engagement, meant to intimidate the West into silence. But as we see in the resilience of the Ukrainian energy workers and the coalition of the willing, the truth is that you cannot bomb a nation into loving a dictator. This winter, the world isn't just watching a war. It's watching a crime against humanity being committed in real time under the guise of strategic interests. The question for the international community remains: how much longer can we allow the gray zone to remain a playground for a regime that views the cold as its most effective weapon? The pressure now shifting toward the coalition of the willing marks a definitive pivot in the global response to Russian obstructionism, moving the conversation from theoretical diplomacy to the hard reality of advanced military deterrence. As the Berlin Peace Framework, a proposal that saw Ukraine offering historic concessions, remains stalled by the Kremlin's refusal to engage, the moral and strategic burden has landed squarely on the shoulders of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and their allies. These nations are no longer just supporting Ukraine. They are being forced to act as the primary guarantors of European stability in the face of a direct challenge to the rules-based order. The receipts are undeniable. If the platinum diplomatic track fails because Putin refuses to accept anything less than total subjugation, the only remaining language is the language of consequences. This is why we are seeing an urgent, high-stakes push for the delivery of long-range capabilities and enhanced air defense systems that can finally level the playing field. The MeidasMighty need to understand that this is the moment where the rhetoric of "as long as it takes" meets the reality of whatever is necessary. President Zelenskyy has been clear: if the aggressor is allowed to reject a fair peace and continue a campaign of infrastructure terror, the Western coalition must provide the tools to strike back at the source of that terror. We're talking about the Deep Strike campaign, a strategic necessity to ensure that Russian strikes on Ukrainian energy grids are no longer cost-free for Moscow. The coalition is currently debating the deployment of a multinational force to secure Ukrainian skies and maritime borders, a move that would represent the most significant escalation of Western involvement since the start of the full-scale invasion. This is the ultimate test of resolve for the democratic world. Will they allow a dictator to outlast their patience, or will they provide the decisive military leverage required to force a genuine negotiation? The facts on the ground show that the timeline for gradualism has expired. With US-led peace efforts reaching a 90% consensus among allies but hitting a 100% wall at the Kremlin, the coalition of the willing is the only thing standing between a sovereign nation and a permanent state of war. Leaders like Keir Starmer and Friedrich Merz are increasingly signaling that the last resort is now the only resort, mobilizing frozen Russian assets to fund a massive surge in lethal aid. This isn't just about winning a war, it's about preventing the total collapse of international law. As the pressure mounts, the world is watching to see if the coalition will finally turn the platinum standard of diplomacy into a titanium shield of defense. The truth doesn't care about Putin's stalling tactics, and as this coalition prepares its next move, the message is louder than ever. Freedom is never free, and it's time to pay the price for a lasting peace. It was never truly about NATO expansion or border security. It was always about the total subjugation of a neighbor. What makes this moment so incredibly dangerous is the level of diplomatic bad faith we are witnessing from the Kremlin. The West offered a massive strategic concession, a platinum standard deal that required Ukraine to make the agonizing sacrifice of its long-term defensive goals to end the bloodshed today. But instead of engaging with the substance of the proposal, Moscow responded with bureaucratic dismissiveness, claiming they hadn't even seen the formal details while simultaneously ramping up drone strikes on civilian energy grids. This is the definition of a bad actor state using the language of diplomacy as a weapon of war. It's a masterclass in authoritarian gaslighting designed to exhaust the West's patience and fracture the unity of the democratic coalition.